The Metroid series is one of my favorite franchises in all of gaming. I know that's a very blunt statement to begin with, but I wanted to establish how my approach to this series would be on this channel. By extension, the Metroidvania genre is one of the most iconic genres in all of gaming, and it was Metroid 1 on the NES that was the genesis of said genre. While the title spoils what I think about Metroid 1 in terms of how it holds up today, what I want to get across is how influential Metroid 1 and by extension the entire series has been on the wider gaming ecosystem, especially Super Metroid when I get to that. That being said, in terms of Metroid's relation to Nintendo's wider list of IPs, in truth, Metroid has never performed Mario or Zelda levels in terms of total sales. As a result, Metroid has historically been relegated to the sidelines. In fact, my introduction to this series was thanks to Smash Bros. However, as a certified Metroid fan, one thing myself and I'm sure other fans in the community can agree on is that we are two things: loyal and patient. I mean, this year this video releases, Metroid Prime 4 is now releasing after being MIA for what, 8 years? However, to get back on track, in the wider public conscious, people born between the 80s to the 2000s at the very least know or recognize the Metroid series, in most part thanks to the series' main protagonist, Samus Aran. Samus Aran is bar none gaming's most iconic female lead, considering that at the time video games were a predominantly male hobby. At the same time, given the era Metroid 1 released in, it's no surprise that a major video game would have a female lead. Remember, by Metroid 1's release, we already had characters like Ridley, Sarah Connor, She-Ra, and even Wonder Woman to go further back. In fact, I think, personally, this series substantially benefits from having a female lead. On one hand, in terms of later games that featured a somewhat similar aesthetic to Metroid, Samus in the modern day has been able to differentiate herself from her male counterparts like Doomguy or Master Chief, as themes like maternity/motherhood are a very prevalent topic in this series, whether unintentional or not. Although, I will say, my favorite part about the whole Samus is a woman revelation was that when Metroid 1 was initially released, the developers literally ran a psyop operation into getting you to think that Samus was a man, only for the ending to reveal a hot babe. In fact, this is off topic, but relates to the discussion. Similar to Mario and Zelda, back in the 80s, there was a planned Metroid cartoon in the works, until it was halted before the series entered production. The series would have been produced by DIC Entertainment, who were the same people that animated the aforementioned Mario and Zelda cartoons, as well as the Captain N series. Interestingly, the only reason we know the cartoon existed in the first place was promotional material that surfaced during the estate sale of a former DIC employee. The promotional material is available online, and from guessing what the tone would have been for the show, given the Nickelodeon Slime title, it's a safe assumption it would have been a kid's cartoon knockoff of Alien. It's situations like this that affirm to me why a vast majority of adaptations fail, simply due to the fact that the people that work on these series have zero knowledge of the source material, preferring instead to tell their own version, completely unrecognizable, almost like a parody. I guarantee you whoever greenlit this was a suit who saw a design of Samus and fell for the ruse. I know I've been rambling for a while, but that tangent was to explain the general concept of the series. Metroid has been on my personal Mount Rushmore video game series, and every revisit reaffirms that to me. For now, this video is meant to focus on the flawed but brilliant legacy of Metroid 1. Longtime viewers of the channel know that when I begin a new series, I always like to explain the origin story to set the stage. To get straight into it, the Metroid series creation has been accredited to 4 central people: Satoru Okada, Yoshio Sakamoto, Hiroyoji Kiyotake, and the legendary Gunpei Yokoi. If you go onto the Metroid series main article on Wikipedia, these 4 men are the ones credited with creating the series, since they all worked on the first game, with each serving a different role in the development team. To break it down, Okada was the director that masterminded the series' creation, Yoshio Sakamoto was a character designer alongside Hiroyoji Kiyotake, and Gunpei Yokoi was the producer as well as head of Nintendo R&D 1, a subsidiary of Nintendo all 4 men developed Metroid 1 under. However, to touch back on the Wikipedia article, there was another member of the development team named Makoto Kano who wrote Metroid 1's scenario. A scenario writer is a term you often hear in game development. To use movies as an example, they're the equivalent of a screenwriter. Their job is to break down the key plot points of the story scene by scene, that way writers can expand those ideas via dialogue. The most likely explanation as to why Kano is not directly credited for helping create Metroid is probably that he joined the team after the main 4 conceptualized the series. I know that point was kind of a sidebar, but one thing I've learned while making videos like this is that in video game development, like any big endeavor, is a team effort. We oftentimes like to give credit to one person for creating something special, but in truth, it's the unexpected and ordinary like artists, writers, and programmers that make a difference. To focus back on Metroid 1, the artistic origin of the Metroid series is heavily inspired from the sci-fi horror genre from the 1960s to the 1980s. Yoshio Sakamoto, who would later go on to supervise future installments, has given the most credit to 1979's Alien, a movie that everyone watching this video has hopefully seen at least once. This is important to mention, as the Metroids, the namesake of the series, are essentially a family-friendly version of the Xenomorphs. In fact, while we're on the topic of Alien, the special effects designer H.R. Geiger, who actually created the Xenomorph itself, was a huge inspiration for the Metroid 1 art team, specifically his biomechanical art style. If you don't believe me, take a moment to compare and contrast the Chozo statues alongside the doors Samus uses to Geiger's work on Alien to see what I'm talking about. Side note, the doors Samus uses to travel in between rooms, while we never see what they look like inside, something the Prime games ignore for gameplay reasons, I'd wager the interior probably looks like the corridor from 2001: A Space Odyssey. I'll go more in depth when I discuss Metroid's gameplay flow, but suffice to say, when Metroid was being conceived, it was designed to combine the 2D platforming of Mario and the exploration of Zelda. Metroid would release for the Famicom Disk System in 1986, the following year for North America, and 88 for Europe. Once the dust settled, Metroid would go on to become a commercial and financial success, nowadays regarded as one of the best games on the NES. I know some of you are wondering why I've gone on so long without mentioning Metroid Zero Mission. Well, to be coy, the answer is, I'll get to it when it's the focus of the video, so stay tuned. For now, I think the time's come to set up Metroid 1's plot. To start with a bit of world building, the Metroid series is set in the vastness of space with humans and aliens settled across the galaxy, all of whom live under the governance of the Galactic Federation. To go on a side tangent for a moment, the games till this day have never delved into the inner workings of the Federation, such as its politics and exactly how big it is. Though according to the Metroid Wiki, the highest authority in the Federation is the Interstellar Congress, which is composed of the numerous member states that have joined the Federation. That being said, if I had to guess the Federation's system of government, it probably functions like the UN, which makes sense why they always hire Samus to fix their problems, or more specifically, a parliamentary system, which countries like the UK and Japan have in our world. Another point also is that Metroid has an in-universe calendar dubbed the Cosmic Calendar, and while it does use the 20x something style, it's nice that there is some type of chronology within the series. On top of that, every Metroid game takes place in a linear series of events. To be more specific, after Metroid 1 follows the Prime series, which then follows the rest of this series from release order, with the exception of Fusion and Other M, which I'll get to that one. However, thankfully, every entry stands on its own, so someone who wants to start with Fusion doesn't need to play Metroid 2, for example. It's mainly Easter eggs or callbacks for longtime fans. Suffice to say, in this era of peace, there will always be those who seek to threaten it. Before the events of Metroid 1, the space pirates, led by the rogue AI Mother Brain, hijacked a Federation ship carrying Metroid embryos. Using beta rays to accelerate the growth of the Metroids, the space pirates begin weaponizing the Metroids, ready to unleash terror across the galaxy. The Federation, fearful of the Metroid threat, hires bounty hunter Samus Aran to end the space pirates operation located on planet Zebes once and for all. Post-editing Matt here. I use Zebes and Zebeth interchangeably throughout this video, so I just wanted to say that to give some extra context, okay? Back to the video. One topic about Samus that needs to be discussed before beginning the game, in official descriptions of her bio on numerous occasions states her to be a bounty hunter as her main occupation. Here in the West, when we hear the words bounty hunter, characters like Boba Fett are the first to come to mind. However, Metroid's definition of a bounty hunter is completely different compared to that of Star Wars. In fact, there's an interesting story related to this topic. The story goes that during the early development of Prime 3, Retro Studios wanted to include contracts as a side activity Samus could partake in. When they approached Nintendo about the idea, according to them, Nintendo vehemently shot down that idea, explaining that that's not what they constitute as a bounty hunter. I understand why they made this distinction, as bounty hunter comes with negative connotations, but in the context of Metroid 1, Samus is given a contract to take out Mother Brain. By Nintendo's definition, Samus is more appropriately a private contractor for the Federation. This is also made even more head-scratching, where in the Japanese version, completed save files show Samus standing with bags of money. To shift for a moment to talk about Samus herself, Samus' design has made her a recognizable icon in the video game landscape. In Metroid 1, her design resembles what many people have come to recognize. However, in the first game, Samus' power armor resembles a more typical sci-fi spacesuit. One of my favorite design details are the tubes that connect from the back of her biceps to her wrists, with Metroid 1 interestingly being the only game where it makes an appearance. I don't know what its purpose would be from a practical standpoint, but it's a piece of her design that's been forgotten after this game. While we're on the topic of Samus' suit, the various suit in Metroid 1 doesn't give Samus the iconic large shoulder pads, as well as protection from heat damage, as those features aren't introduced until the next two games. Another point I also want to hit on while on the topic of Samus's armor, in Metroid 1, Samus's power armor is treated very similarly to the aforementioned characters like Doomguy, Master Chief, and Iron Man, in that it's a suit of armor Samus puts on to do the crazy feats she does. However, as the series went on, later games would retcon the power suit by saying that it's actually biologically configured to Samus, kind of like a second skin. In fact, since I mentioned Iron Man earlier, later Iron Man comics had Tony Stark invent armor that functioned the same way. As for how it translates into gameplay, when Samus is facing forward like at the start or on an elevator, the sprite is very faithful to the official art. However, when Samus is running, it's a bit of a different story as she does technically what I would describe as a chicken run, which I don't think is a byproduct of her being part Chozo. Meanwhile, her helmet sprite is strangely massive, probably so it's easier to see her during gameplay, or maybe it's another Alien reference. Anyone who remembers the climax in Alien 1, the hazmat suit Ripley uses to fight the Xenomorph also has a massive helmet, so maybe that's the explanation. Overall, Metroid 1's story is as simple as any 80s video game. To mention Zero Mission once again, when I eventually get to it, I will delve into that game's lore. That game very much expanded the overall story, establishing Samus's backstory as well as the role that Chozo played in creating the Metroids. Either way, with the premise established, once you start the game, Samus's mission begins. Similar to the first notes of World 1-1 or the Overworld theme, the jingle and introduction of Samus is one of the most iconic moments in gaming history. It, like the example I've just mentioned, established a trope that subsequent games would follow. The jingle, titled Samus Appears, plays at the start of every new session or when respawning at a checkpoint. It is one of my favorite sequences across the entire series. Whenever I hear this, I get that feeling of time to get to work. Of course, to give credit to the composer, the song was composed by Hirokazu Tanaka, who goes by the alias Hip Tanaka in the credits. Something I've never discussed on this channel and a topic I haven't seen other commenters bring up is that during this era in Japan, it was common practice for publishers to poach the talent of their rivals. So game publishers got around this by demanding their developers to go by pen names. By the SNES, this practice was no longer used, but the tactic of companies trying to steal a competitor's talent happens in every industry. Once you gain control of Samus, the best place to begin is by delving into how exactly a Metroid game works. Well, backtracking to when I discussed development history, the folks at R&D1 envisioned a game that combined the 2D platforming of Mario and the exploration of The Legend of Zelda. With that being said, I'd surmise they delivered on that idea. To quickly go over Samus's controls, Samus can move left or right, jump, and fire her cannon. As anyone who's played Metroid 1 knows, Samus at the start is nothing to write home about. For one thing, Samus can only fire in two directions, either by facing forward or holding up on the D-pad to aim upwards. While some might brush that aside, saying that it was common for 2D shooters at the time, it's not so much fun when the enemy you're trying to shoot at is too low for your pellets or out of range. Though this doesn't last long, as the Long Beam upgrade is an early upgrade everybody obtains after leaving the tutorial area. Which, speaking of the tutorial area, when you spawn in, Samus begins her mission in the caverns of Brinstar. Brinstar is where you accumulate yourself to the controls and battle basic enemies. Samus initially doesn't begin at full health, so it's recommended by myself to spend a couple of minutes farming for health pickups. In Metroid 1, every screen is divided into rooms. At the end of every room are doors that break up each individual room. To start with a quick criticism, one of Metroid 1's worst features is that if Samus and an enemy enter a door at the same time, Samus is guaranteed to take damage, sometimes multiple at a time. Made even worse when certain enemies fly in a zigzag pattern or actively follow Samus through doors. However, by traveling right far enough, you'll eventually reach a dead end. And here is where Metroid teaches its most important lesson. You see, everybody understands that the goal of every level in a 2D platformer is to travel right to reach the goalpost, right? Well, remember when I kept mentioning that Metroid also took inspiration from Zelda's exploration? You see, in the very first moments when you begin the game, rather than go right to the dead end, what you're intended to do is go left, obtain the Morph Ball upgrade, hearing the iconic item get theme. The Morph Ball is not only one of Samus's iconic items, it's also been at the forefront of theories that have attempted to explain its functionality. Well, to this day, not a single entry has ever explained this. However, a plethora of fan theories have attempted to answer this question. The TLDR answer is Chozo magic. However, my personal theory, and one that's been repeated throughout fan discussions, is that since Samus' suit is biologically linked to her, she's able to change her physical form to the point of being able to transform into a ball. The Prime games best demonstrate this by having a glow of energy emit from inside the morph ball. Using that understanding, that would mean that Samus has the ability to turn herself into a sphere of energy, wherein her armor acts as a shell, similar to that of a snail. This is all, of course, a fan theory. However, the best, and technically not an explanation, is that part of Prime 1 where Samus learns through a data log that the space pirates are unsuccessfully attempting to replicate the morph ball. In fact, in that same data log, the space pirates hilariously admit that in each attempt, the test subject as a result is completely crushed. So even in universe, nobody understands the morph ball. The morph ball gives Samus the ability to curl into a ball and explore the rest of planet Zebes. That comment I said about going left might not sound like a big deal given how far games have come nowadays, but at that very moment, Metroid teaches its most important lesson, that to beat the game, you have to ignore every convention established in previous 2D platformers. The entire ethos of Metroid's gameplay is the idea of show, don't tell. This is where I believe the limitations of the early generations of consoles helped conceptualize the Metroidvania. Since there are no waypoints telling you where to go, you're left to your own devices, resulting in a game that doesn't, if not at all, handhold you throughout your entire adventure, which is one of the major reasons why I love the Metroid series. It's not perfect, and it's true some entries do it better than others, but throughout this series of videos, I'll keep the topic of discussion focused on the entry I'm currently on. Now that you're accustomed to the controls, the rest of Planet Zebes is ready to be explored. Brinstar, the opening area you explore, is where you'll acquire every early game upgrade, as in essence, it connects the entirety of Planet Zebes. One of the first things you see after leaving the tutorial is a long vertical corridor that teaches you the basics of platforming. In Metroid, Samus has two forms of jumping. The first is a standard jump like you see Mario do, meanwhile her second jump has her perform a somersault in midair. To execute a standard jump, you have to press the jump button while standing still or immediately after Samus starts running, whereas to perform a somersault, you have to make sure Samus gets a good running start, then press the jump button while holding the analog stick in the direction she's facing. Some of you might be wondering why exactly Samus has two jumps. Well, for starters, when Samus performs a normal jump, she can still shoot enemies at the cost of midair momentum, whereas the somersault can travel further, later becoming the definitive jump thanks to a later upgrade. Before moving on, I also want to give special attention to the fact that, while it's great Samus has two jumps, Samus in Metroid 1 has really slippery traction, as well as being able to jump really high, though that last point is series-wide. I think for the latter point, it was definitely designed that way to mimic being on an alien planet. However, Metroid 1's later platforming sections get really tight when you have little room for error. That last section was added in later, which will explain why what comes next is very dense. As I said earlier, Brinstar is the opening area that acts as a giant corridor to Metroid 1's other areas. Technically speaking, Brinstar is how you'll access Kraid's Lair alongside Norfair, which connects to Ridley's Lair, and Torian, the final area. With the exception of Torian, you can access the other areas so long as you have the right equipment. And now that we can explore the rest of Brinstar, your overall goal is to obtain 3 very important upgrades for Samus. By ascending the corridor high enough, you'll come across your first door leading to another vertical corridor on the other side. Going back and replaying Metroid 1, I realized that vertical corridors are strangely common in this game. They are, like I said, a connector to other areas. In this yellow corridor, by falling all the way down to the bottom and going down a corridor, Samus obtains her first missile pack upgrade. Missile packs give Samus an alternate fire mode by pressing the select button, allowing her to shoot missiles. Unlike her traditional cannon, missiles have limited ammo, and you'll need to defeat enemies and hope you're lucky enough for them to drop. Unfortunately, at the start of the game, missiles are a very important resource, one you should actively try to be frugal with. This is most evident when obtaining the long beam, one of the upgrades I alluded to earlier. To obtain it, I backtrack to the blue corridor, entering the second door on the left. At the end of the corridor is a red door, a new type of door I haven't mentioned up until now. Unlike traditional blue doors, opening them requires Samus to spend 5 missiles to permanently unlock them. This is what I meant when I said missiles are a very valuable resource early on, as the missile pack I previously demonstrated is the only one in Brinstar I'm able to immediately get. So if you're not careful with missiles, you'll unfortunately have to grind for missiles like I did, which takes time from your in-game clock. This is something I actually ended up learning while researching Metroid 1's item drop. The actual method the game uses to calculate what item is dropped is based on what frame you defeated an enemy. But what surprised me the most was that when initially entering a room, the game would put a cap on the amount of missiles or health you could obtain, which thankfully can be reset by leaving and re-entering the room. For the record, all this comes from a thread on the Metroid subreddit. Afterwards, the only task left to do in Brinstar is to obtain the last 2 items. One of them being the energy tank, which, self-explanatory, increases Samus' total HP, but the more important item, and the one that's required to beat the game is the Morph Ball Bombs, another one of Samus's iconic abilities. Officially from here, the rest of Metroid opens up, allowing you to explore the rest of Planet Zebeth with the exception of Torian. When I say that Planet Zebeth opens up, after leaving the tutorial, you can technically go wherever you want, barring some exceptions here and there. I know that contradicts what I just said, but part of Metroid's core gameplay is about exploring new areas to obtain upgrades to in turn access new areas. That being said, how your playthrough of Metroid 1 turns out will probably have major differences compared to mine. Metroid 1 gives you the freedom to tackle any area in any order you want. If you want to go to Kraid's Lair or Norfair first, you can do that, and that for the time was never heard of. Sure, by 1986, Zelda 1 offered players similar levels of freedom with its semi-open world design. What I'm talking about specifically is translating that overhead exploration into 2D. Ironically, given Samus's current state, she realistically wouldn't last long against this game's bosses. So for the time being, I'll have to do a bit of item hunting to even the playing field. At the end of the room where the first missile pack is located is an elevator that leads to Norfair. In the Metroid series, elevators act as not only checkpoints if you get a game over, but also as a means of transportation to other areas. I don't know what it is, but I love these moments across the series. I know some of you might be thinking why it's a bit strange I'm nerding out over an elevator, but to break it down, for one thing, the music and ambience is great. I think a reason why a lot of initial franchises like Metroid, Mario, or Zelda were so successful was the developers had a fundamental understanding of the concept they took inspiration from, thereby retooling them to fit their story. To me, Samus going down an elevator exudes the same suspense as the hallway scene from 2001. It's that brief moment of respite before facing the next challenge. In Metroid 1, every area is in some way loosely connected to one another. There's no overworld like in Zelda, as everything is set underground like a massive interconnected dungeon. Norfair, the area I've just entered, is connected to Ridley's lair, and if I wanted to, there's nothing stopping me from going straight there to fight Ridley. Well, the real reason why I'm in Norfair is to get mainly missile packs and 2 mandatory items. You see, despite my talk about non-linearity and exploration, Metroid does, as a technicality, push you into going into a certain direction as a precaution to prevent you from soft-locking the game. And definitely as the series goes on, the world design deliberately does become more linear. Linearity in Metroidvania is a whole topic in of itself. In fact, throughout this series retrospective, I will be constantly revisiting that train of thought, applying it specifically to the game I'm covering. In the case of Metroid 1, Norfair should always be the first area visited after getting the Morph Ball Bombs. The Morph Ball Bombs are required not only to get another essential item, being the high jump boots, but also to get the plethora of missile tanks located in Norfair. The high jump boots are very self-explanatory. They allow Samus to jump higher. However, to get the high jump boots, you'll have to use Morph Ball Bombs to reveal a hidden path. A path, by the way, that was given no context clues beforehand. Yeah, we're getting Zelda 1 cryptic here, although on a positive note, Samus does have an unlimited supply of Morph Ball Bombs, so you can place them to your heart's content. The blocks also do respawn after a while, but what's especially worse about them is that, when backtracking, you have to keep jumping over and over again to make sure Samus lands on one when they respawn. One of the most important skills in Metroid 1 is not only knowing where secret passageways are hidden, but also mastering the Morph Ball Bomb jump. Now, I will not claim to be a master of the bomb jump, as my skill is completely abysmal. However, the stuff you see speedrunners do where they skip entire sections is something you'll never have to do. At most in this series, it boils down to using a bomb to reach a low opening. Still, it is incredible when you see really professional speedrunners use bomb jumps to sequence break. However, when applying that topic to Metroid 1, there's never any notable case where bomb jumping was needed for that exact purpose. Essentially, sequence breaking in Metroid 1 is done the old-fashioned way, mainly involving using glitches and sorts. By going further past the room with the high jump boots is a hidden corridor that leads upwards to the crown jewel of Norfair, and my personal favorite Metroid item, the Screw Attack. The Screw Attack is one of Samus's iconic moves, with even a variant of it serving as the series' official logo. What the Screw Attack does, for those uninformed, is it gives Samus's somersault a damage effect alongside invincibility from enemy attacks. From the moment you get it, the Screw Attack all but becomes the best method to defeat enemies, especially the ones that constantly respawn from pipes when you need to grind missiles or energy. By this point, Samus is equipped with her most powerful items, thus making her better able to handle harder areas. You see, another key aspect of Metroid's core gameplay is the act of using new items to acquire items previously unavailable, which means my next objective is to return to Brinstar. Unfortunately meaning I'll have to backtrack all the way to the elevator, which leads to my next major point. The fact of the matter is that backtracking in Metroid 1 is terrible. Even though you can go wherever you want if you have the correct upgrades, One of the biggest issues with Metroid 1's world design is the lack of cohesion in the overall design. For example, going from the entrance of Norfair to the room with the screw attack and vice versa is very simple. However, you might be wondering, does that mean I have to backtrack the same way I came? The answer, unfortunately, is yes. Later games would work around this issue by being more surgical with its level design, carefully considering each item's location. Alongside, I believe, most importantly, having shortcuts to ease the player's troubles. Also, Metroid 1 has no in-game map, as this was a time when games incentivized you to create your own maps as a clever way to get around hardware limitations. What's funny though is that, if done well, I love backtracking in this series, especially in future playthroughs. In essence, backtracking in this series is as common as jumping in Mario. Every Metroidvania has the inevitable backtracking segment if you plan to go for 100% completion. However, a moment ago I said, if done well. To spoil it now, one of the reasons why Super Metroid is my favorite entry is that on a perfect run, backtracking is completely negated. Whereas, on the flip side of that coin, you have Fusion, where in that game, backtracking is very common. However, what makes backtracking in Fusion really good is that old areas are given new life thanks to upgrades, making the world feel more interconnected. Metroid 1 unfortunately has none of that, as every area remains static throughout your entire playthrough. I think the biggest sin a Metroidvania can commit is when it makes its backtracking feel like busy work. Anyone watching who's 100% of Prime 2 knows what I'm talking about. That, in my opinion, is the most egregious example. And for the record, I love Prime 2, but if I do replay it, I don't even bother to 100% it. For the time being, my return to Brinstar is a very quick journey. Thankfully, I managed to acquire all the items I needed, with the only item left in Brinstar being the Various Suit, which in Metroid 1 reduces Samus' damage by half. By this point in the game, barring a couple of missile energy expansions, the bosses are the only tasks left to do, and the first boss I decide to fight is Ridley. However, unfortunately, before Ridley's Lair are the remaining missile packs in Norfair, which are very out of the way. To be more specific, the elevator to Ridley's Lair is located at the bottom rightmost area of Norfair, whereas the remaining missile packs, alongside the wave beam, are located on the other side of the area. So for the time being, I needed to retrace my steps to the room where you'll normally get the screw attack. Besides backtracking in Metroid 1 being especially terrible, the other major factor, one that I think is overall the worst aspect of Metroid 1, is the overall sameness of the level design. It is very easy to get lost when playing Metroid 1, as multiple room layouts are oftentimes copy and pasted, resulting in new players becoming easily confused. On top of that, there are many rooms that serve no overall purpose. Case in point, on my journey to obtain the remaining missile expansions, in the room with the fake lava pit, I accidentally took a wrong turn, ending up in a dead end. Another trick Metroid 1 also likes to use is to present two pathways that lead to the same goal. It sounds great when you hear it, however, the trick is that one pathway will lead to an important item like a missile pack, while the other does not. So when you play Metroid 1, the key to the best playthrough is to follow the best pathway with the correct upgrades while ignoring every distraction. In fact, it's how I played Metroid 1 for this video. On my revisit to Norfair, I could have gotten the wave beam, however, as anyone who's played Metroid 1 understands, the wave beam is completely inferior to the ice beam. I'm not gonna lie, I completely ignored it for this playthrough. But to at least explain how it works, when fired, the wave beam causes Samus' beam to fire in a helix pattern, along with the ability to pass through walls and enemies. However, since the ice beam is required to beat the game, you should always ignore the wave beam no matter what. What's especially worse is in Metroid 1, Samus can only equip one beam at a time. So if you want to change beams, you have no choice but to backtrack to the Chozo statue that holds it. Once again, later entries fix this issue by allowing Samus to combine her beams or by having the ability to switch between them at the player's leisure. With Samus by this point very powered up, it's time to take the elevator to battle one of the game's main bosses. Since Metroid 1 is a non-linear game, Metroid gives you the freedom to decide whether to battle Ridley or Kraid first. Before you go thinking it's a straight path to the boss, each of their respective lairs are still fully fleshed out areas with their own items to collect. There are thankfully no mandatory items, as it's the usual missile and energy expansions. In Ridley's Lair specifically, there are a total of 3 missile packs, but 2 energy tanks. This is why overall doing Ridley first is the best way to play Metroid 1, alongside Ridley's Lair not being terribly difficult. Ridley, as we'll see in a bit, is a pathetically easy boss for this point in the game. What it does make up for in difficulty is that it has not one, but 2 segments where if you fall down, getting back is notoriously difficult. Everyone who's played Super Metroid knows about the fake-out energy tank, making its first appearance in this game. What I'm more specifically talking about is the pixel-perfect jump over a large pit. To be honest, situations like this are where I fully agree with the notion of using restore points. Or you could just ignore it, which I think is perfectly valid, as Metroid 1 grades your ending based solely on time instead of completion and time as later games would do. On the bright side, if you want to fight Ridley right away, from here you can just jump down and enter the door on the left. However, before confronting Ridley, I actually want to take a moment to talk about another one of my favorite aspects of Metroid as a whole, that being the atmosphere. Since Metroid 1, the series has succeeded in creating fantastic alien worlds via a combination of music and art design. On one hand, Metroid soundtracks are able to master that feeling of isolation and mystery when exploring each area to create, in my opinion, the perfect ambient soundtrack. Ambient is essentially the perfect word I can use when describing this series' catalog. Truth be told, I love putting on ambient Metroid mixes when doing everyday tasks. And that playlist, in case you're wondering, is songs from Mainline to Prime. In fact, the best thing I'm looking forward to with Prime 4 is the soundtrack. Even for being an NES game, Metroid 1 still has a great soundtrack. I'm no musician, but the melodies featured in this game are fantastic. Brinstar is one of the series' most iconic tracks, thanks to its most popular rendition in Smash Bros., alongside other great tracks like Kraid's Lair or the Item Room theme. The whole series has a fantastic OST, and it just so happens everyone who works on it understands the assignment. On the flip side of that coin, we have the art direction. On this topic, when you play through this series, you come to realize how genuinely dark and mature Metroid can be. There's a great video on this topic specifically about classic Metroid. If you ask me, Metroid has always been one of Nintendo's more mature franchises, especially when you consider Nintendo's always had a reputation of being very family friendly. So with Metroid, it's no way surprising that fans, including myself, give it the dark moniker. I remember when I was younger, experiencing this series for the first time, I always remember it feeling very unwelcoming, in the sense that I wasn't used to games that actively tried to instill fear in you. It's not surprising given Metroid's roots. Other stories like Alien, obviously, Event Horizon, and Dead Space are other examples of using similar effects. It's why I think all the examples I just give are set in space, representing mankind's fear of the cosmos and the unknown. In fact, to further delve into how Metroid conveys that point, 2D Metroid tends to emphasize horror by focusing on the alien worlds Samus explores through its environment and enemies, whereas the 3D Prime series does it through a cosmic horror angle. To admit the truth, there have been moments this series got a good scare out of me. Some of the areas I'll say are very out there in their design, a clear victim of the NES's limitations. Norfair has this one area where, for some reason, the platforms resemble gumdrops. In case you're wondering, it's where the fake lava pit that leads to the dead end I mentioned way back. While we're still on the topic of Norfair, there's another area that's filled with what I assume are bubbles or eyes. What makes this area notorious is not its design, but the fact that there are certain segments where you'll be unable to return to normal ground if you fall into the lava. Out of curiosity, I got to this point in Zero Mission, and I still don't know what it's supposed to be. Overall, Metroid is proof you don't need cheap jump scares to make a game scary. It's a mix of art, sound, and presentation that makes Metroid special to me. Returning to the hunt for Ridley, the hallway preceding the boss is full of enemies I quickly ignored, though quick is somewhat ironic given all the slowdown you're seeing. Metroid 1 unfortunately tends to suffer from slowdown if too many enemies are on screen or even sprite flickering in certain versions. Like I said before, the reason I chose Ridley first is that in Metroid 1, Ridley is a complete joke to fight. If you have the Ice Beam like I do by this point, you can use it to easily freeze Ridley's fireballs, making him unable to attack. The fireballs move in a very slow, bouncing motion, and a couple of good, well-placed shots leave Ridley completely vulnerable to be pelted with missiles. That's right. A major boss required to beat the game can become totally harmless if you have the correct weapon. Missiles will be your only way of damaging Ridley and Kraid, so once again, missiles demonstrate themselves in being essential, as it's what every boss is vulnerable to. To be honest, from here, there's nothing more to discuss about Ridley's boss fight. What you see is what you get. I mean, I guess I can talk about his design. Ridley's Metroid 1 sprite is very silly. He's meant to be a pterodactyl, but I don't know, in this game, bro looks like Barney. He definitely becomes more intimidating in later games, especially when he gets his cyborg enhancements. When they're defeated, the boss explodes out of nowhere with the item theme played afterwards. It's very anticlimactic considering what happens afterwards. In the next room, over a lava pit that strangely cools down for some reason, is my second to last health expansion. From here, the only area left with items and a boss is Kraid's Lair. Unfortunately, Kraid's Lair is located all the way back near the tutorial area. So that means I have to backtrack all the way through both areas. Overall, to give a progress report on this run, I would say it's turned out a success. To spoil the ending a bit, there are multiple endings you can receive depending on how long it takes for you to beat the game. Typically in 2D Metroid, a perfect ending varies from game to game, but it's usually less than 2 hours or 3. However, whenever I replay Metroid 1, I've always gone the second best ending, since depending on the story, I'll sometimes go for 100%. A completionist run will extend your total game time, since after all, backtracking will be required at certain key moments. However, the beauty is that since Metroid is at its heart designed to be non-linear, you can complete the game at your own discretion. In my opinion, you should never feel like you're in a rush on a first playthrough. Metroidvanias can be very unwelcoming to newcomers, given their hands-off approach to gameplay. However, a golden rule I personally use is to get as many items as possible on a first run, then worry about completion on repeated playthroughs. These games aren't that long. A first playthrough should run you at max 3 hours. Plus, repeated playthroughs is where the real fun of a Metroidvania lies. It should be said, when I describe multiple endings, what I mean is the difference in fanfare you receive at the end. The less time it takes to beat the game equates to Samus showing more skin in the ending. Interestingly, in the Japanese version, there's a way to manipulate the in-game clock using the game's passcode system. For context, the Japanese version uses traditional save slots like in Zelda 1, whereas the international version uses a passcode system. You see, in Metroid 1, passcodes don't function like traditional passwords. Their major difference is that the game takes the code entered to generate a specific save point. The Metroid Wiki has an article listing every passcode in case you're curious, but to go over some of my favorites, longtime Metroid fans know about the famous Justin Bailey passcode, spawning Samus and Norfair with their pink leotard, and every upgrade to top it off. There's also one that's a Dragon Ball Z reference. There's the hilariously called Mother Brain Toast that automatically defeats the final boss, and then there's the infamous Engage Ridley Mother. You see, besides a funny name for a passcode, what makes this passcode so infamous it's not its name, it's that its effects will differ based on which version of Metroid 1 you're playing. What it's intended to do is to begin Samus and Torian after having defeated the bosses, alongside the secondary effect of raising the total game time to the equivalent of 314.5 years. Meaning when you escape Torian, the game will end with the worst ending since, after all, you took too long to beat the game. However, remember when I just said the passcode's effects depends on the game version? This is something I actually just learned while writing this segment. If you look at the back of an NES cartridge, you'll notice it may have 3 or 5 pins. That might sound inconsequential, however, in Metroid 1, this piece of trivia actually affects the Ridley passcode. If you're playing the 5-pin version, inputting the passcode will straight up crash the console, forcing a restart. Meanwhile, the 3-pin version will start Samus in her pink leotard, unable to move past a garbled first screen. It doesn't stop there, as, believe it or not, other ports are affected as well. Basically, every version from the GBA to the Switch Online either causes an automatic crash or a return to the title screen. So, you're probably wondering how the footage you're seeing is playable. The answer is, if you type 7 in place of the N and J at the end, you'll actually get a playable version. In fact, it was how I was able to get footage of the bad ending. According to fans knowledgeable in this subject more than I, typing the initial passcode causes the game to spawn Samus in an undesirable location, resulting in the crash. In short, the passcodes are one of my favorite discussion topics of Metroid 1. From a game design standpoint, Metroid 1 was very unusual for the time, so it required a new solution for a different problem. To return to the main game, the last area left to explore is Kraid's Lair. The entrance itself is located at the corridor after the starting room. By bombing the blocks, the corridor ventures down with the elevator located at the bottom. Beforehand, I got the last energy expansion, which you can get at the very beginning if you're able to use the knockback mechanics to reach it. If for some reason I return to Metroid 1, I always like to do that trick, though it's been a while since I played Metroid 1 before making this video, so I didn't do it for this playthrough. Technically speaking, since Kraid's Lair is located at the starting area, it's subtly intended for Kraid to be your first boss. Again, since Metroid 1 lets you travel unimpeded, Kraid's Lair becomes accessible after retrieving the Morph Ball bombs. However, in my opinion, and I'm sure others will agree with me on this, arming Samus with all her upgrades takes priority over fighting the bosses. Speaking of bosses, Kraid himself is located in the lowest room in the area. In the center corridor, the third red door is the path that leads directly to Kraid if you want to fight him straight away. However, to give a compliment to Metroid 1's level design, the pathway I took to get the remaining missile tanks does circle back to where I need to go. In retrospect, the boss areas themselves are very simple to explore. As long as you understand that the boss is located at the bottom of the level, through trial and error you'll eventually reach your destination. There is a particular moment before reaching Kraid where you'll have to freeze floating enemies to platform across a door out of reach. This in particular is a less stressful version of the notorious jump in Ridley's Lair, as if you fall down you can quickly try again, unless you have the screw attack. Even though I've stated the screw attack is my favorite upgrade in the series, unlike in later games, upgrades are unable to be turned off via the status screen. That means in cases like here where the screw attack can destroy frozen enemies, it's one of the many demonstrations of Metroid 1's dated design. There's even another moment where, on the way back from Kraid's boss, the game has you perform a mandatory repeating block section. If this were any other game, this would have involved the space jump. However, it's at the end of the hallway where we battle Kraid. Before the boss, the game is nice enough to have an indefinite spawning enemy if you need to grind missiles. Kraid, as funny as this is to say, is definitely more difficult than Ridley. Kraid's moveset in Metroid 1 consists of him using the holes in his body to launch projectiles while at the same time throwing his claws at you. Kraid overall has more methods of attack compared to Ridley, so you can see why it's funny he's considered a harder boss. To explain why to anyone that doesn't know, Kraid is considered a joke that not even Samus herself takes seriously. This is best demonstrated with even the way I fight Kraid, where I just get in front of him and blast him full of missiles until he's defeated. Since his surprise appearance in Dread, Kraid's only mainline appearances have been in Metroid 1 and Super. He was interestingly enough supposed to appear in Prime 1, but was cut from the final release. Similar to Ridley, Kraid's usual gigantic appearance wasn't fully captured due to hardware limitations. I don't have a good comparison for you this time. The most I could come up with is he looks like a mutated Sandshoe. Before moving on to the final boss, I would like to give a special mention to the fake Kraid, who is entirely optional, but was absolutely frustrating for many players back in the day. By now, with Ridley and Kraid defeated, the path to Mother Brain has been opened. Before I left the boss room, I got the energy expansion tucked in a corner for a free health refill. Though it may not increase Samus' total HP, Metroid 1 has a surplus of energy expansion scattered across planet Zebes. It may sound unnecessary to get it by this point, however, the free health refill is not worth ignoring. After exiting Kraid's lair, the entrance to Torian is located at the top of Brinstar. Before the elevator, the game places a series of pipes, allowing you to grind for missiles or energy. The reason it's recommended you refill your health back at Kraid's lair is so the enemies you grind have a higher chance of dropping missiles in order to complete the last area more effectively. Which, don't worry, I will explain. The next room, however, is the last stop before the elevator. Inside are statues of Ridley and Kraid that are only activated after they've been defeated, explaining why we needed to hunt them in the first place. It's when the statues are activated, the last bridge to Torian opens. Now, to be honest, after the elevator reaches the end of the shaft, I am of the opinion that creating a restore point is very recommended before proceeding further into Torian. Torian's design is on one hand by the bugs very linear, whereas on the flip side of that coin, the Metroids now making their debut are really the only major enemy in Torian. Even for being the series' namesake, Metroids on the surface look very harmless, if not a little cute. However, don't be tricked by how squishy they look, as they are the most dangerous threat to the universe. How Metroids like to attack is by latching onto their victim's head, thereby proceeding to then drain their victim's quote-unquote life force, sort of similar to that of a leech. If the victim is unable to break free, the end result is their body is left dull and lifeless. Metroid 1 doesn't demonstrate this, but the cutscene you're seeing from Zero Mission shows why they're considered an apex predator. In gameplay, if a Metroid latches onto Samus, she'll have to enter Morph Ball mode and use bombs to knock them off. The only way to defeat a Metroid is to freeze them with the Ice Beam, making them vulnerable to missiles. This is again another reason why ignoring the Wave Beam is recommended if not mandatory on a typical playthrough, as it's unable to incapacitate the Metroids. And if you think you can just ignore them, remember, multiple Metroids can attack Samus at the same time. You see, the hardest part about fighting Metroids in the first game isn't that they can aggressively attack you. In fact, it only takes one shot of the Ice Beam to freeze them. It's the fact that if you're unlucky with missile drops, Metroids can quickly deplete your missile ammo, which I'll say now is mandatory to beat the final boss. Metroids when defeated will drop either a large quantity of health or missiles. So on one hand, if you need to grind missiles before the final boss, Metroids are a great source. However, remembering what I said about Metroid 1's drop system, you can easily lose all your missiles on the way to the final boss. That's why I think using restore points is a good insurance policy at this late in the game. I'd also like to give a special mention to the onion rings that target Samus off screen. Unfortunately, they don't drop items, but during the final boss they'll immediately become important. Once your missiles and health are in good status, at the end of Torian is the last red door. Inside the room is where the final boss of Metroid 1 begins. Mother Brain herself rests at the end of the corridor. However, in your way are sets of tubes that need to be destroyed in order to reach her. Unfortunately, their only weaknesses are missiles. For the entire duration of the final boss, missiles will be your only source of dealing damage, whether against Mother Brain or the tubes. To top it off, the amount of missiles it takes to destroy even a single tube is based on the footage about 10. This is why getting every missile pack in Metroid 1 is worth the endeavor, as while technically you can leave the boss room, being left in Torian with no missiles is a scenario you don't want to be caught in. Also, don't forget, if you get a game over, you'll respawn at the elevator with minimal health and whatever missiles you had before your demise. essentially forcing you to grind again or use a restore point, which I cannot state is highly recommended by this point in the game. The onion rings I also mentioned earlier will constantly respawn if you destroy them. However, by freezing them, it prevents another from spawning in to take its place. They're especially useful when used as platforms to better align your missiles. There are also turrets that fire in a pattern, and they're especially annoying since they can knock you off, wasting time as the tube regains health. Oh yeah, this is sincerely why the final boss can be very difficult if you come in unprepared. I genuinely recommend you do a little bit of grinding, 1 before entering Torian and 2 before you begin the final boss. Now, a good thing about missile drops from Metroids is that they'll always give at least a dozen when dropped. If you follow the strategy I just gave and use restore points, believe me when I say that the final area is made much more bearable. Eventually, after destroying the last tube, Mother Brain becomes open to attack. Unlike Ridley or Kraid, Mother Brain remains still in her jar, unable to physically harm Samus, instead relying on the base's defenses. Similar to the previously mentioned bosses, once again the only method to damage Mother Brain is via missiles. What's even more infuriating about the final area is that even if you follow this strategy I laid out, your chances of success are not guaranteed. Even though I entered Torian with close to 200 missiles, it took me a little over 100 missiles to complete the final boss from start to finish. And I got every missile expansion in the game, so imagine someone on a first playthrough who didn't get every upgrade. The hardest part of the final boss isn't Mother Brain herself, it's the things around her that make it difficult. The rings and turrets can whittle you down if you're not paying close attention, as well as the lava pit that you can be knocked into. Whatever you do not fall into the lava pit, as even with high jump boots, Samus will be unable to reach the opening. There is, however, a way to save yourself by using the ice beam to freeze the rings, then using a regular jump to return to safe ground. This, in turn, makes the rings unable to harm Samus if you time it correctly, and as long as you stand inside the tube blasting Mother Brain with missiles, she'll eventually be defeated. In the context of the wider Metroid lore, Mother Brain was an AI created by the Chozo to oversee their civilization on planet Zebes. It quickly rebelled, shocker, eventually coming to lead the space pirates. For being a brain in a jar, Mother Brain is a pretty intimidating villain. The music in her room is especially creepy. It's that gooey sound that makes Mother Brain sound like a mad scientist experimenting in her hidden base. After a barrage of missiles, Mother Brain explodes, ending the threat she poses to the galaxy. However, here is another way Metroid deviates from at-the-time conventions. Instead of an abrupt ending with a congratulations screen, Mother Brain upon her defeat activates a dead man switch, initiating a self-destruct sequence. I know I said previously not to get a game over, however here especially is where you don't want to get a game over. Your final task is to escape Torian before the base self-destructs. Just be careful as you get closer to the end as the platforms become progressively smaller. Honestly, take your time in this last section. When you land, catch your footing, then jump when you see the next platform. Don't panic and stay calm, and you'll eventually reach the elevator. It's when escaping the base, Samus marks her first mission as mission complete. However, even with the galaxy saved, the Metroid threat still exists, ready to plunge the galaxy into chaos once again. Typically on a first playthrough, many players will receive the third ending, where Samus removes her helmet while still wearing the body armor. However, since I went for 100%, which added extra time, I got the second best ending, aka the Leotard ending. Metroid, despite its ups and downs, is still a landmark achievement in video game history. It broke from traditional conventions at the time to create a genre that to this day has produced some of the best games ever released. Nowadays, the game is very dated. However, from here onwards, the series only gets better and better. That's why, in particular, I've been very nice to Metroid 1 as a whole throughout this video. Sure, like I said, the game is very dated, and if I had to choose from the series' palette, I would rather play Super, Prime, or Fusion. My golden rule into getting into long series is to start with the most critically acclaimed entries and work backwards from there. Though with really old games like Metroid 1, I think you should play them once and wash your hands of it afterwards. Plus, since we live in a time where emulation is so easily accessible, why not play Metroid 1 on your brick laptop? I for one think it's great that people still play these games, as it shows why they're still worth remembering regardless of age. After all, it's better than buying the same sports or COD game every year. As someone who never got to play these games in their prime, only being able to experience them thanks to Let's Plays or emulation, my respect for classic games has only developed over the years. In some cases, I think a lot of them are better than what we have nowadays. Is it wise to say that? I don't think so. But I think for me, it's the fact that now that I'm getting older, I have less time to play games like I once did. So, I began to revisit games I had either played when I was younger or saw others play. I for one think it's great that people still play these games, as it shows why they're still worth remembering regardless of age. For whatever flaws Metroid 1 has, its greatest gift to me will always be debuting one of my favorite franchises of all time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, and subscribe, as it's the only way YouTube's algorithm knows I exist. And to those unaware, please turn off restricted mode, that way videos like this are recommended to you. Stay tuned for future uploads. Thanks again for watching.